Margaret Sullivan's weathered hands remained steady as she poured her morning coffee, the steam rising in the crisp Montana dawn. At 95, she still maintained the same routine she'd followed for decades on her family farm. The morning, news droned quietly from her ancient radio until a breaking report cut through her peaceful ritual. 3 armed and dangerous inmates have escaped from Mountain Valley Maximum Security Prison. Residents are advised to... Mags, as she was known locally, didn't react beyond a slight tightening around her eyes. Instead, she rose with deliberate grace, walked to her study, and opened a locked cabinet that hadn't been touched in years. Inside, a custom M40A5 rifle lay in perfect condition, maintained with the same discipline she'd shown in Vietnam. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Mag Sullivan's kitchen as she resumed her routine, muscle memory from decades of farm life guiding her movements. Every action remained precise, economical. Habits that hadn't faded since her days. In the core, the coffee cup sat exactly 3 inches from the edge of her worn oak table, positioned for optimal access without risk of spilling. Some habits never died. Through her kitchen window, she could see the distant mountains where her grandfather had first taught her to shoot. The farm had been in the Sullivan family for 4 generations, though she was the last of the line now. The land had shaped them. All taught them patience, respect for nature's power, and the importance of being prepared. The radio continued its warnings about the escaped prisoners, but Mags paid it minimal attention. She'd learned long ago to filter information, to focus on what mattered. 3 inmates, 2 serving life sentences for murder, 1 former military turned mercenary, last seen heading north from the prison. Estimated 12 hours free. Sheriff. Tom Cooper's patrol car kicked up dust as it approached her driveway. She smiled slightly, recognizing his driving pattern, cautious but purposeful. She'd taught him that during his first deployment, back when she was Master Sergeant Sullivan, Marine Scout sniper instructor. "Morning, Shadow Scout," Tom called out as he stepped onto her porch, using her old call sign with familiar respect. At 65, he was the only one in the county who knew her full history, who understood what the quiet farmer had once been. "Little early for a social call, Tom," Mags responded, though they both knew why he was there. "Got 3 very unfriendly types might be headed this way," he said, accepting the coffee she offered. "You're the most isolated farm in the county," Mags nodded, noting how he stood slightly sideways, maintaining clear sightlines to both approaches. She'd taught him that too. "The Matthews place is closer to the prison," she pointed out. "Matthews? Family's away at their daughter's wedding in Missoula," Tom replied. "Your farm's the first occupied property they'd hit coming this direction." What he didn't need to say, was that they'd see an elderly woman living alone as an easy target. The thought almost made her smile. Almost. "I appreciate the warning, Tom," she said, her voice carrying decades of quiet authority. "But we both know I can handle unwanted visitors." Tom shifted slightly, wrestling with duty and knowledge. "Mags, these aren't ordinary troublemakers. Torres, the military one, he's got special forces training. The others are just plain vicious. Let me station a deputy here." "No." Her tone was gentle but absolute. "Your deputies are needed in town, protecting people who can't protect themselves. I may be old, Tom, but I haven't forgotten anything." He knew that tone, had heard it in combat when she'd made decisions that saved lives. "At least let me leave you a radio. Direct line to dispatch." She accepted this compromise with a slight nod, knowing it would ease his mind. As he turned to leave, she called out, "Tom, remember what I taught you about dealing with desperate men? Let them think they're in control until they're not," he quoted, smiling. "I remember everything you taught me, Shadow Scout." After he left, Mags began her own preparations. Not the obvious ones. She was too smart for that. Instead, she went about her normal routine, but with subtle adjustments. The porch chair moved 6 inches left, providing better cover. Bird feeders repositioned to mark distances. Wind chimes hung strategically to detect movement. To anyone watching, she was just an elderly farmer going about her morning chores. They wouldn't notice how she mapped lines of sight, identified potential cover, or mentally calculated ranges to every approach. They wouldn't recognize that every seemingly casual movement was building a tactical advantage. The morning passed, quietly, but Mags knew better than most that silence often preceded the storm. She'd learned that lesson in war, and war had taught her to be ready for anything. So she continued her preparations, invisible to anyone who didn't know where to look, waiting for whatever would come next. As the morning progressed, Mags moved through her farm with practiced efficiency, her mind drifting between present concerns and memories from a life few knew she'd lived. The weight of her hidden rifle brought back moments she usually kept locked away, like the first time she'd proven herself to the skeptical men of her unit. Vietnam, 1968. The brass had fought against having a female sniper, but desperation and her extraordinary skill had won out. Her first mission had saved an entire platoon, taking out 3 enemy snipers from positions they'd thought impossible. That day, she'd earned the name Shadow Scout, the ghost who watched over Marines. The radio crackled with updates. The escapees had been spotted 20 miles north, moving through backcountry. Mags checked her sightlines again. Muscle memory from thousands of similar assessments guiding her movements. She remembered another mission, years later, when she'd transitioned from active sniper to instructor. Young Marines like Tom Cooper had looked at her skeptically at first, until she demonstrated why she held the record for longest confirmed kill in the Corps for over a decade. Patience, she'd always taught them. A sniper's greatest weapon isn't the rifle, it's the mind, the ability to think 3 moves ahead, to understand your target's psychology, to control the situation before anyone knows there is one. The sound of a distant helicopter drew her attention. Search patterns, she noted, but too wide to be effective in this terrain. She'd learned that lesson in the mountains of Vietnam, where she'd developed techniques still taught to Marine snipers. Today, her dining room wall held no military photos, no medals, though she had plenty. Instead, a simple Marine Corps emblem sat beside her parents' picture. Below it, invisible to visitors, was a hidden panel containing her Distinguished Service Cross, silver stars, and the presidential citation for an operation still classified. A crow landed on her fence post. Unusual for this time of day. Mags noted its direction of flight, another lesson from her training days. Animals were better warning systems than any technology if you knew how to read them. She thought about her last active mission, the one that had led to her biggest decoration, and her decision to return home. A hostage situation gone wrong, multiple shooters, impossible odds. She'd set up 4 positions, used psychology and precision to make the enemy think they faced a full team. In the end, she'd saved 27 lives without taking a single shot. That mission had taught her the most valuable lesson of all, that true strength came from wisdom, not just skill. It was about knowing when not to shoot as much as knowing how. The present called her back as another police update came through Tom's radio. The escapees had shown tactical awareness, avoiding main roads, staying off the grid. The military training of their leader was evident. Mags allowed herself a small smile. She'd trained hundreds of military personnel over her career, written manuals still used for advanced sniper training. Whatever skills these men had, she'd likely helped develop. The techniques they were using. Her phone rang. The secure line only 3 people had the number for. "Shadow Scout," a familiar voice said. "Langley sent me to warn you. Torres, the military escapee, he was Black Ops. Some of his missions crossed paths with yours back in the day." "Thank you, Director," she replied calmly. "I'll keep that in mind." After hanging up, she made one subtle adjustment to her kitchen chair, ensuring it would creak in a specific way if anyone sat in it. Another lesson she'd taught: let your environment be your ally. The sun climbed higher as Mags continued her preparations, each movement deliberate, each decision informed by decades of experience. She wasn't just a legendary sniper, she was the one who had trained a generation of legendary snipers. And soon, some very unfortunate individuals might learn exactly what that meant. Deputy Sarah Chen's patrol car pulled into Mags's driveway just as the afternoon wind began to pick up. The young officer moved with the precise efficiency that had first caught Mags's attention 3 years ago, when Sarah had started coming around to learn marksmanship from the old farmer lady who used to shoot competitively. "Miss Sullivan," Sarah called out, using the formal address despite their closer relationship. "Sheriff Cooper asked me to check in, maybe stay a while." Mags watched her approach, noting how Sarah unconsciously used the techniques she'd taught. Her angular approach, maintaining awareness, staying out of obvious lines of fire. The girl was a natural, reminded her of herself at that age. "Tom's worried," Mags stated, not a question. "The whole town's worried," Sarah confirmed. "They escapees hit a gas station 2 hours ago. They're armed now, and Torres—" She hesitated. "Torres recognized my name when they took the attendant's phone," Mags finished. "That's why Tom sent you." Sarah nodded, her hand unconsciously touching her service weapon. "He said you'd figure it out, said you taught him never to underestimate what the enemy might know about you." The wind chimes Mags had positioned earlier rang in a particular sequence, telling her about wind direction and speed. Perfect shooting conditions. Not that she was planning to need that information. "You've been practicing," Mags observed, noting Sarah's stance. "Your balance is better. Every morning, like you taught me, though I still can't figure out how you spot my mistakes without even seeming to look." Mags allowed herself a small smile. "The same way I know you've got a backup piece in your left boot now, and you've changed your body armor to the lighter ceramic plates." Sarah's eyes widened slightly. Few people knew about her equipment changes. "The Marines taught you all that." "The Marines gave me the foundation," Mags corrected. "Experience taught me to notice everything. Speaking of which, tell Tom his roadblocks on County Road 23 are too obvious. They'll come through the lumber mill access road instead." Before Sarah could respond, Mag's secure phone rang again. The deputy watched as her mentor's expression shifted subtly while listening. "Understood," Mag said finally. "Yes, I remember that operation. No, I don't need extraction. Thank you, General." She hung up and caught Sarah studying her with new eyes. "That wasn't about a farming cooperative, was it?" "No," Mags admitted. "Torres wasn't just special forces. He was part of an operation I consulted on, one that went bad. Thunder rumbled in the distance as storm clouds gathered over the mountains. Sarah checked her radio, confirmed it was working. "What do we do now?" "We wait," Mags replied calmly. "And you remember what I taught you about patience being a weapon?" The afternoon stretched on, the coming storm matching the building tension. Mags had Sarah help her with routine farm tasks that just happened to improve visibility and tactical advantage around the property. They stored loose items that could block sightlines, secured tools that could be used as weapons. Throughout it all, Mags kept teaching, turning every action into a lesson. "Notice how the birds are acting. They see things we don't. Remember how the wind affects distances. Keep thinking 3 steps ahead." As evening approached, the first heavy drops of rain began to fall. Sarah's radio crackled with reports of the escapees' last known position, less than 10 miles out. "You should head back to town," Mags told her. "They'll need you there." "Sheriff's orders are to stay," Sarah replied firmly. Mags nodded, recognizing the steel in the young deputy's voice. "Then let's get ready. The storm's not the only thing about to break." Together, they made final preparations as darkness approached, mentor and student, youth and experience, each knowing that the coming night would test everything they'd learned about patience, courage, and the quiet strength that came from being prepared for anything. The storm arrived in full force just after sunset, rain drumming against the farmhouse roof as Mags finished her evening routine. She'd sent Sarah to do a perimeter check, not because she needed one, but because she wanted the deputy safely, out of sight when their visitors arrived. The first sign came exactly as she'd expected, the slight scrape of boots on her back porch, barely audible over the rain. 3 distinct footfall patterns, trying to be quiet but betraying their positions to her trained ear. They'd approached from the south, using the cover of her barn, exactly as she would have taught someone to do. Mags continued washing her dishes, her movements unchanged. Through the window's reflection she caught movement, 3 shadows, military positioning. Torres was leading, she noted, which meant he'd recognize the tactical value of her farm's position. Not just a hideout. Then they had bigger plans. The back door opened with a creak, the same creak she'd carefully maintained for decades. "Evening," she called out without turning. "Coffee's fresh if you'd like some." Her calm voice caught them off guard. She heard it in their hesitation, saw it in their reflected stances. 2 weapons visible, the third held back. Classic strike. A team formation. "Ma'am," Torres spoke first, his voice carrying the forced politeness of someone used to command. "Sorry to intrude. We've had some car trouble." Mags turned slowly, taking in their appearances. Torres stood in front, tall and composed despite his prison clothes, carrying himself like the special forces operator he'd been. Behind him, Matthews, the younger murderer, nervous energy and quick eyes, and in the rear, Connor, the older killer, cold eyes and steadier hands. "Car trouble in this storm?" she asked mildly, noting their positions relative to her pre-planned firing lanes. "That's unfortunate. Phone's in the living room if you need to call for help." "That's very kind," Torres replied, his eyes scanning the room professionally. "But I don't think we'll be making any calls just yet." Matthews moved toward her kitchen cabinet, but Torres stopped him with a subtle gesture. "Good discipline," Mags noted. They'd worked together before the prison break. This wasn't just an escape. It was a planned operation. "Nice farm you've got here," Connor spoke up, his voice carrying an edge of threat. "Real isolated, peaceful." "It is," Mags agreed, her stance shifting imperceptibly. "They've been in my family since before I served." She saw the slight change in Torres's expression, the recognition. He knew exactly who she was now. The question was whether he'd tell his companions. "Served?" Matthews asked, smirking. "Like in the wax or something?" "Something like that," Mags replied, watching Torres's growing tension. He was reassessing, recalculating. She'd seen that look before, in other operations, when targets realized they'd walked into more than they'd expected. "Mrs. Sullivan," Torres said carefully, "we're going to need to stay here for a while. No one needs to get hurt." "Margaret Sullivan," she corrected. "Master Sergeant, retired." "But then, you already knew that, didn't you, Captain Torres? Or should I say former captain?" The atmosphere shifted instantly. Matthews and Connor raised their weapons, but Torres held up a hand. "How do you know my rank?" he demanded. "The same way I know this isn't just an escape," Mags replied calmly. "You're here for something specific, something connected to Operation Shadowfall." The color drained from Torres's face. Behind him, his companions looked confused, but Mags's attention stayed on the leader. She saw the moment he made his decision. "Matthews, Connor, watch the perimeter," he ordered. "The lady and I need to have a discussion about old times." As his companions reluctantly moved to comply, Mags allowed herself a small smile. The game was changing, pieces moving into position, just as she'd planned. Sarah, watching through her scope from the barn's upper window, saw the 2 men emerge onto the porch. Her radio remained silent. Mags had been clear about maintaining radio silence until given the signal. The young deputy settled in to wait, remembering everything her mentor had taught her about patience and timing. Inside, Mags and Torres faced each other across her kitchen table, two professionals recognizing the deadly dance they were about to begin. The storm raged outside, but in the farmhouse kitchen, a different kind of storm was brewing, one that had been building for far longer than anyone but Mags knew. Torres sat exactly where Mags had predicted he would, the kitchen chair that gave him the best view of both doors while keeping his back to the wall. She'd chosen her own position carefully decades ago, placing her chair to command the same advantages while appearing completely natural. Operation Shadowfall was classified, Torres began, his voice tight. How does a retired female Marine from Vietnam know about it? Mags took a deliberate sip of her coffee. You really should look closer at the operational history, Captain. Who do you think wrote the infiltration protocols you used? That high-angle approach through seemingly impossible terrain. That was my signature. She saw the realization hit him. Shadow Scout, he breathed. You're the original Shadow Scout. They told us that was just a legend, a story they made up for training. Most legends have some truth to them, Mags replied, noting how his hand had moved slightly closer to his weapon. Like the legend about why you're really here. This isn't about escaping prison, is it? It's about recovering something you hid during Shadowfall. Outside, the storm intensified. Through the kitchen window, Mags caught glimpses of Matthews and Connor patrolling, their movements betraying their lack of real tactical training. They were muscle, nothing more. Torres was the real threat. The mission went wrong, Torres said quietly. You know that, don't you? Your protocols were perfect, but someone leaked our position. We lost good men. And you think the evidence of who betrayed you is hidden somewhere in this region, Mags finished. That's why you chose this prison, this escape route. You're not running from something, you're running to something. A flash of lightning illuminated the kitchen, and in that instant both veterans moved with instincts honed by years of combat. Torres's hand went to his weapon, but Mags was already moving, her coffee cup creating a perfect distraction as it slid across the table. When the thunder cracked, they were frozen in a new position, Torres half standing, his weapon slightly raised, while Mags remained seated but now held a small-caliber pistol that seemed to have materialized from nowhere. 20 years as a sniper instructor, Mags said calmly, and the first thing I always taught was that the obvious weapon isn't the real threat. Your eyes went to the rifle cabinet when you entered, but you never checked for closer weapons. You're good, Torres admitted, slowly easing back into his chair. Better than the stories. The question is, Mags continued, her aim never wavering, are you smart enough to realize what's really happening here? Why this farm? Why tonight? Before Torres could respond, Matthews burst in from the porch. Cap, we got company. Police lights on the main road. Mags saw the tactical mind working behind Torres's eyes. You called them, he accused. No, Mags replied, but I knew they'd come. Just like I know your real target isn't anywhere near here. The evidence you're looking for was moved 3 days ago, when intelligence learned about your escape plan. The revelation hit Torres hard. Outside, Connor started shouting about more police lights approaching from the south. The trap was closing, but Mags saw something in Torres's expression that concerned her. Not defeat, but desperate calculation. Matthews, Connor, Plan B, he shouted. The barn! Mags didn't react as Torres backed toward the door, weapon trained on her. She remained seated, seemingly unconcerned, which made him even more nervous. You're not even trying to stop us, he realized. Don't need to, she replied calmly. You've already done exactly what I expected. By the way, you might want to. Ask yourself who really leaked your position during Shadowfall, and why they waited until now to let you find out. The implications of her words hit him just as more lightning flashed, illuminating the tactical situation with perfect clarity. They weren't the hunters here. They never had been. And Shadow Scout's legend, he suddenly realized, had been dramatically understated. As Torres backed onto the porch, Mags allowed herself a small smile. Phase 1 was complete. Now the real operation could begin. The barn doors slammed open as Matthews and Connor rushed inside, seeking cover from both the storm and approaching police lights. What they didn't know, but Mags did, was that Deputy Sarah Chen had already evacuated through the hidden tunnel Mags had maintained since the Cold War, taking up a new position in the grain silo. Mags watched through her kitchen window as Torres followed his men more cautiously, his military training evident in every movement. He kept glancing back at the farmhouse, clearly unsettled by their encounter. She could almost see him putting the pieces together. "Shadow Scout," she heard him mutter into his radio. "The original Shadow Scout. Matthews, Connor, whatever you do, don't underestimate her. She's not just some old lady." Lightning illuminated the yard between house and barn, and Mags allowed herself a grim smile. Torres had no idea how right he was. Her phone buzzed, a text from a number few people had. "Package secured. Green light for containment. L. Perfect timing, as always." Langley hadn't changed in all these years. The police lights that had spooked Torres's group weren't actually getting closer, just one of many tactical deceptions Mags had arranged. The real operation was much quieter, much more precise, just like she'd taught her students. Her secure line rang. "Go ahead," she answered, knowing who it would be. "Master Sergeant." General Harrison's voice came through. Clearly, despite the storm, Torres's file just got declassified. "You need to know. He wasn't just the fall guy for Shadowfall. He was the original target." Mags processed this, decades of operational experience helping her adjust plans on the fly. "The leak was intentional," she said. "They wanted him to escape, to lead them to something." "Exactly, but here's what nobody else knows. Your farm isn't random. Your land backs up against the old military communications bunker from the 60s, the one you used for Operation Stormwatch." Mags finished. "My first deep cover assignment. The missing evidence isn't from Shadowfall at all, is it? It's from Stormwatch. Got it in one, Shadow Scout. Torres thinks he's hunting, but he's being hunted, and they used you as bait, knowing he'd recognize your name." Mags heard movement from the barn. They were planning something. Torres was too good to sit still for long. "Who's behind it?" she asked, though she suspected she knew. "Chamberlain," the general confirmed her fears. "He's still alive, still pulling strings. After all these years, he's trying to clean up loose ends." Colonel James Chamberlain, the man who'd tried to shut down the female sniper program, who'd later been implicated in selling military secrets. The man she'd helped expose, or thought she had, 40 years ago. Torres doesn't know, she realized. He thinks he's looking for evidence about who betrayed his team, but he's really being led to expose something much older. Exactly. And Chamberlain's people will eliminate everyone involved once they have what they want, including Torres and you. A crash from the barn caught her attention. They were breaking into the old storage area, getting closer to the hidden bunker entrance without even knowing it. "Thank you, General," she said. "I'll handle it from here." She hung up just as Sarah's signal came through. 2 short clicks on the radio. The deputy had spotted movement in the tree line. Additional players entering the field. Mags moved to her window, checking angles out of old habit. Torres and his men had stumbled into something much bigger than a prison break, much older than Operation Shadowfall, and they'd brought it right to her door, just as Chamberlain had planned. But Chamberlain had made one crucial mistake. He'd forgotten the first rule she taught every sniper she'd ever trained: never corner someone who knows the territory better than you do. The storm intensified, but Mags remained calm. Let them come. She had home field advantage, decades of experience and something none of them expected, a score of her own to settle with Chamberlain. In the barn, Torres and his men were getting closer to secrets they didn't understand. Outside, Chamberlain's cleanup team was moving into position, and in her farmhouse, Shadow Scout prepared for one last mission, one that would finally bring a 40-year shadow war into the light. The old floorboard creaked exactly as designed when Mags shifted position near her window. In the barn, she could see flashlight beams dancing as Torres and his men searched. Through her scope, she counted 4 additional shadows moving through. The tree line, Chamberlain's cleanup crew, right on schedule. "Sarah," she whispered into her radio, "status?" 4 armed individuals approaching from the north. The deputy reported quietly. "Military gear, professional movement, they're boxing us in." "No," Mags corrected, "they're boxing themselves in. Remember what I taught you about reversing the trap?" A moment of silence, then understanding in Sarah's voice. "Make them think. They're the hunters until it's too late." In the barn, Torres had reached the hidden panel that would lead to the old communications bunker. Mags watched him run his hands along the wall, sensing something was there, but not knowing what. His professional instincts were good, another reason Chamberlain wanted him eliminated. Her secure phone vibrated. A text from Tom. "State Police. Diverted. You've got 30 minutes clear." Perfect. Tom had understood her earlier hint about the roadblocks. She'd trained him well. Lightning flashed again. And in that instant, Mags caught a glimpse of something that changed the tactical situation. One of Chamberlain's men carried specialized breaching equipment. They weren't just here to eliminate witnesses. They were here to destroy evidence. "Sarah," she radioed, "adjust position to silo west window. When you hear the signal, 2 shots, high to low." "Copy," Sarah replied. "But what's the signal?" "You'll know it," Mags assured her. Just like she'd taught the young deputy. Sometimes the best communication was unspoken. In the barn, Torres had finally found the hidden catch. The panel slid open with a metallic groan that carried through the storm. Mags watched him hesitate, realizing this discovery had been too easy. Her living room lights flickered, not from the storm, but from power being diverted to the old bunker systems. Right on cue, Torres's radio crackled with interference, old frequencies coming back online. "Boss," Matthews called out, "something's wrong. This setup, it's too professional." For once, the murderer was showing good judgment. Mags allowed herself a small smile as she made her next move. She switched on her old military radio, set to a frequency she hadn't used in decades. Static filled the air, then a series of coded clicks, an ancient recognition signal from Operation Stormwatch. In the barn, Torres froze. She saw him reach for his own radio, muscle memory taking over as he responded with the countersign. Then realization hit him. "It's a setup," he shouted to his men. "The whole thing, Shadowfall, the escape, all of it. We're not supposed to find evidence. We're supposed to be buried with it." Chamberlain's team was closing in, using the storm for cover. They thought they were being stealthy, but Mags had positioned wind chimes specifically to track movement around her property. Each chime told her exactly where they were. She thought back to her first lesson as a sniper instructor. Position is everything, but the best position isn't always the most obvious one. Time to demonstrate that lesson one last time. "Sarah," she radioed, "get ready, and remember, just like target practice." Through her scope, Mags watched the cleanup teams split up, 2 heading for the barn, 2 circling toward the house. They moved with professional precision, but they'd made one crucial mistake. They thought they were dealing with an old woman who'd once been dangerous. They didn't realize they were dealing with someone who'd never stopped being dangerous. She'd just gotten smarter about it. In the barn, Torres was finally putting it all together. "The evidence isn't down there," she heard him say. "We're not the ones collecting it, we're part of it. Living proof they need to erase." Mags checked her watch. Everything was proceeding exactly as she'd planned. Now came the delicate part, saving the lives of men who thought they were her enemies, while eliminating the real threat. The storm reached its peak as Mags moved to her final position. Lightning flashed again, thunder rolled, and somewhere in the darkness, Shadow Scout prepared to demonstrate why some legends never die. Because Chamberlain had forgotten the most important lesson she'd ever taught. It's not the gun that makes the sniper dangerous. It's the mind behind it. Thunder crashed as Mags moved silently through her darkened house, muscle memory guiding her through a space she'd specifically designed for nights like this. In the barn, Torres was about to discover something that would change everything. Not evidence, but truth. Her secure phone vibrated. Another text from Langley. "Chamberlain's team is led by Marcus Reed." Mags's jaw tightened. Reed, the man who'd executed her entire surveillance team during Operation Stormwatch, then vanished with Chamberlain's help. Now he was back, closing the circle. Through her scope, she watched Reed direct his team with hand signals. He hadn't changed much in 40 years. Same cold efficiency, same brutal precision. But he'd grown overconfident. "Sarah," she whispered into her radio, "the team leader, I trained him. Watch for false retreats and double backs. It's his signature." In the barn, Torres had reached the bunker's main console. Any moment now. The ancient computers hummed to life, screens flickering with green text. Mags could picture Torres's face as he read the mission logs from Operation Stormwatch, the operation that had started everything. "My God!" she heard him breathe through the directional microphone she'd hidden years ago. It wasn't about military secrets. Chamberlain was running a shadow army. Files scrolled across the screen. Training camps, black operations, assassinations. All coordinated through this bunker, all hidden under official missions like Shadowfall. And at the bottom of each report, 2 signatures, Colonel James Chamberlain and his executioner, Marcus Reed. Shadow Scout wasn't just a sniper, Torres realized aloud. She was a whistleblower. She discovered all of this. And survived, too. Tell about it. Reed's voice cut through the darkness as he entered the barn, though not for much longer. Mags watched through her scope as Reed's team surrounded Torres and his men. Perfect positioning, just as she'd taught him. But Reed had forgotten who he'd learned it from. "You really think she's just some retired farmer?" Torres challenged, playing for time. "The woman who took down 3 NVA sniper teams solo? Who wrote the manual you learned from?" Reed laughed. "I know exactly who Margaret Sullivan is. That's why Chamberlain sent me, loose ends from 40 years ago, finally being tied up." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene through the barns. Broken windows. Reed's team had their weapons trained on Torres's group, but their real attention was on the bunker entrance. They still hadn't figured out what this was really about. Mag's radio crackled. "Shadow Scout." General Harrison's voice was urgent. "Reed's not just there for cleanup. Chamberlain's dying, cancer. He's eliminating witnesses before he goes." The pieces clicked into place. Chamberlain wasn't just covering his tracks, he was ensuring his shadow army survived him. And Reed was his insurance policy. Through the barn's windows, Mags caught Sarah's signal. The deputy had identified Reed's backup team, hidden in the tree line, just as Mags had taught her to look for. "You know what your mistake was, Reed?" Torres asked, still playing his part perfectly without even knowing it. "You thought Operation Stormwatch was ancient history." "Oh!" Reed's amusement carried clearly through Mag's directional mic. "And what makes you think that? Because you still haven't figured out why Shadow Scout chose this farm 40 years ago. Why she's been waiting here, maintaining that bunker, keeping everything ready." In her position, Mags allowed herself a grim smile. Torres was smarter than his file suggested. He'd put it together faster than expected. "She wasn't hiding," he continued. "She was hunting. waiting for Chamberlain to make exactly this move. Reed's laugh cut short as realization hit him. Too late. The wind chimes sang their warning pattern, telling Mags that everything was in position. Time to remind them all why Shadow Scout was more than just a legend. She had one chance to save Torres and his men while eliminating Reed's team and ending Chamberlain's legacy once and for all. But first, she had a 40-year-old debt to settle with the man who'd murdered her teammates and thought he'd gotten away with it. Reed was about to learn that some debts never expire and some hunters never retire. Reed's men had Torres's group surrounded in the barn, but Mag saw what Reed didn't. The subtle shift in Matthews's stance, the way Connor's eyes kept darting to the shadows. They weren't just cornered criminals anymore. They were survivors looking for options. "You know what's funny, Reed?" Mag's voice carried through the barn's old speaker system, making her impossible to locate. "You're still using the infiltration pattern I taught you. Third man always slightly back, covering the high angle." Reed's team tensed, weapons swiveling toward shadows. Even after 40 years, her voice commanded attention. She'd trained too many of them too well. "Just an old woman now, Scout," Reed called back, but his eyes betrayed his uncertainty. "Time catches everyone." "Does it?" Mags replied. "Then why did Chamberlain send his best just to handle one retired farmer?" Torres caught on quickly, using her distraction to edge his men toward better cover. Reed noticed but couldn't spare. The attention to stop them, not while trying to locate Shadow Scout. "You really want to know why I'm here?" Reed's voice turned vicious. "Because Chamberlain never forgave you for Operation Stormwatch. You were supposed to train snipers, not investigate your superiors. Your team killed 6 good Marines that night," Mags responded, her voice ice. "My team. Did you really think I'd let that go?" Lightning flashed, and in that instant, Sarah's first shot took out the power box on the barn's exterior. Darkness plunged over the scene, but Mags had operated in darkness for decades. "Torres," she called out, "second storage bay has a metal door. Get your men behind it." Reed's laugh was harsh. "You're helping them now? They're escaped convicts." "No," Mags corrected. "They're witnesses, just like my team was 40 years ago, and we both know how you handle witnesses." Through her scope, Mags watched the subtle tells, Reed's fingers tightening on his weapon, his team shifting uneasily. They'd heard rumors about Operation Stormwatch, about the witnesses who'd disappeared. "Your mistake," Torres called out, now safely behind cover with his men, "was not checking why I chose this prison, this escape route. Shadow Scout's reputation drew me here, because some of us remember the real story about Chamberlain's Shadow Army." Reed's curse told Mags everything. Torres hadn't just been sentenced to prison. He'd been buried there, along with what he knew, until now. "Sarah," Mags whispered into her radio. "Status?" "Reed's backup team is moving east," the deputy reported. "They're trying to flank the barn." "Perfect. Everything proceeding exactly as planned." "It's over, Reed," Mags announced. "Chamberlain's dying. His shadow army is exposed. The only question is whether you're going down with them." "Nothing's exposed," Reed snarled, but doubt had crept into his voice. "No evidence survived Stormwatch. We made sure of that." "Did you?" Mags let satisfaction color her tone. "Check your phone. Check what's being uploaded to every major news agency right now." Reed fumbled for his phone, and in that moment of distraction, everything changed. Torres and his men took strategic positions. Sarah's laser sight appeared on Reed's chest, and somewhere in the darkness, Shadow Scout prepared to spring a trap 40 years in the making. "You taught us to always have a backup plan," Reed said, realization dawning. "The bunker, the files, they're not the real evidence, are they?" "The real evidence," Mags confirmed, "is you, here, now, doing exactly what you did 40 years ago, trying to silence witnesses on Chamberlain's orders." The storm's intensity peaked, but inside the barn, the tension had shifted. Reed's team looked uncertain. Torres's men waited for their chance, and somewhere in the shadows, a legend prepared to demonstrate why some debts can never be cancelled by time alone. The rain hammered against the barn's metal roof as Mags watched the scene unfold through her scope. Reed's team held tactical superiority, but they were rattled. Torres and his men had the advantage of desperation, and in between, a moral choice that would determine everything. "You know what the first rule was?" Mag's voice carried through the old speaker system. "The one I taught every sniper I ever trained?" "Never take the shot unless you're sure," Reed answered automatically. Then caught himself, remembering who'd trained him, who'd instilled those principles he'd later betrayed. "Wrong," Mags corrected. "The first rule was protect the innocent. Everything else is secondary." Through her scope, she saw Torres react to those words. He'd studied her methods, knew her reputation. Now he was beginning to understand why she hadn't simply shot them all when they'd first arrived. "There are no innocents here," Reed argued. "Torres is a convicted criminal. His men are murderers." "And you're an assassin," Mags countered. "The difference is, they were sentenced in public courts. Your crimes are still hidden, like the 6 Marines you killed during Stormwatch." Sarah's voice whispered through the radio. "Reed's backup team is getting antsy. They don't like being in the dark." "Good," Mags replied softly. "Uncertainty makes people show their true nature." Inside the barn, Torres made his move. "Your men don't know, do they, Reed? About the Shadow Army, about Chamberlain's real operation. They think this is just another cleanup mission." Reed's team members exchanged glances. The seed of doubt had been planted. "I taught you better than this, Reed," Mags continued. "Taught you that a sniper's duty is to protect, not to murder. That skill without honor is just another form of violence." "Honor?" Reed's laugh was bitter. "Honor doesn't pay the bills, Scout. Chamberlain understood that. He showed us how to use our skills profitably. By killing your own teammates, by murdering witnesses." The storm's intensity matched the growing tension. Through her scope, Mags watched Reed's men processing this information, saw the subtle shifts in their stances. "You have a choice," she told them. "Same choice Reed had 40 years ago. Same choice every warrior faces eventually. Serve honor or serve corruption." "They won't believe you," Reed snarled, but uncertainty had crept into his voice. "You're just an old woman with old stories." "Am I?" Mag's question hung in the air. "Then why did Chamberlain send his best killer to handle one elderly farmer? Why are you really here, Reed?" Lightning flashed again, and in that moment of illumination, everything changed. Reed's men saw what they hadn't noticed before, how their positions mirrored those from Operation Stormwatch, how they'd been set up to eliminate witnesses, just like 40 years ago. "The code isn't just about shooting," Mags continued, her voice carrying authority earned through decades. "It's about choosing right over easy, about protecting those who need protection, even if they're not perfect themselves." She watched through her scope as 2 of Reed's men lowered their weapons. The balance was shifting just as she'd planned. "Last chance, Reed," she announced. "Surrender now. Testify about Chamberlain's operation. Make something right after 40 years of wrong." But in Reed's stance, Mag saw his choice before he made it. Some men couldn't give up the darkness once they'd embraced it. "Shadow Scout," Sarah's urgent whisper came through the radio. "Reed's giving his backup team hand signals. Whatever's coming, it's coming now." Mags nodded to herself. The time for teaching was over. Now she would remind them all why the code she lived by wasn't just about ethics. It was about survival. The bunker's ancient computers cast a sickly green glow across the barn's interior, as more files from Operation Stormwatch scrolled across the screen. Torres, still behind cover, studied them intently while Reed's remaining loyal men kept their weapons trained. Mission log, June 12, 1983, Torres read aloud. Surveillance team reports unusual activity at Camp Echo. Possible illegal arms shipments. Authorized by... His voice trailed off as he recognized the name. By General James Chamberlain, Mags finished for him. Back when he was just a colonel with ambition, before he built his shadow army. Through her scope, Mags watched Reed's reaction. The younger members of his team were wavering, but Reed's expression had turned calculating. He knew what was coming. Next in those files. Shadow Scout, Sarah's whisper came through the radio. One of Reed's backup team is accessing a satellite phone. Heavy encryption. Let them, Mags replied softly. Everything's going exactly where it needs to go. The bunker's next file appeared, and Torres's sharp intake of breath told Mags which one it was. The surveillance photos from the night, everything changed. These men, Torres said, studying the images. They're loading crates, but those aren't. Military uniforms. Private contractors, Mags explained, her voice carrying through the speakers. Chamberlain's first recruits, the beginning of his private army. And there, in the corner of that photo, recognize anyone, Reed? Reed's curse echoed through the barn as his own younger face appeared on screen, standing next to Chamberlain, watching the illegal operation unfold. What I couldn't figure out, Mags continued, was why my surveillance team was ordered to that location that specific night. Until I realized we weren't sent to observe. We were sent to be eliminated. Clean up loose ends. Right, Reed? Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene through the barn's broken windows. In that instant, Mags caught the subtle shift in Reed's stance that told her he was about to move. But something went wrong that night, Torres pieced together, still studying the files. The surveillance team wasn't completely eliminated. Shadow Scout survived. Survived? Reed's laugh was harsh. She didn't just survive. She vanished with evidence that could have exposed everything. Evidence we've been hunting for 40 years. And now you think you've found it, Mags commented. Hidden in my farm's old bunker. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not just silencing witnesses, but finding what you missed 40 years ago. Her phone vibrated. Another message from Langley. Just one word. Confirmed. Perfect timing. You know what your real mistake was, Reed? Mags asked, watching through her scope as more pieces fell into place. You never asked yourself why I chose this specific farm, why I maintained that bunker all these years, why I kept everything exactly as it was the night you murdered my team. Through her scope, she saw the moment Reed finally understood. His expression shifted from confidence to dawning horror. This isn't just a farm, he realized. It's a trap. Has been for 40 years. And we just walked right into it. Not just you, Mags corrected. You brought exactly who I've been waiting for. Check your satellite phone, Reed. See who your team just called for backup. As Reed grabbed his phone, Mags allowed herself a grim smile. In a few moments, Chamberlain himself would have no choice but to come out of the shadows. 40 years of patience was about to pay off. But first, she had to ensure everyone in that barn survived the next few minutes, because the revelation that was coming would change everything, and she needed witnesses alive to tell the truth this time. Reed's satellite phone chirped with an incoming message. Through her scope, Mags watched his face change as he read it. In the green glow of the bunker's ancient monitors, the truth was finally emerging. Impossible, Reed breathed. These coordinates, this authorization code. Not impossible, Mags corrected through the speakers. Inevitable. You really think I spent 40 years just waiting? I've been broadcasting from this bunker every night, Reed, sending out a very specific signal, one that only certain equipment would recognize. Torres caught on first. The missing evidence was never in the bunker, he realized. The bunker itself is the evidence, still actively connected to Chamberlain's private communication network, Mags finished. The one he uses to control his shadow army. The one he thought was completely secure. Until tonight. Sarah's voice came through Mags's radio. Multiple vehicles approaching from the north, military grade, running dark. Right on schedule, Mags responded. Then, to the barn. You know what today is, Reed. June 12th. Exactly 40 years since you murdered my team, and exactly 1 hour since I started broadcasting everything in Chamberlain's network to every intelligence agency in the world. The barn erupted in chaos as Reed's team processed this information. Through her scope, Mags watched the power dynamics shift. The younger operators were looking at Reed differently now, understanding they'd been drawn into something much bigger than a simple cleanup operation. That's why you let us break in here, Torres said. Why you wanted witnesses. We're not just seeing old evidence. You're watching it happen in real time, Mags confirmed. Every operation, every illegal contract, every member of Chamberlain's Shadow Army, all of it being exposed right now. And the best part, he had to authorize the exposure himself. Reed's phone chirped again. His face went pale. That's right, Mags continued. When you called for backup, the only way to stop the broadcast was for Chamberlain to personally come here and use his command codes, which he's doing right now, with witnesses present, including 3 escaped convicts who have nothing left to lose by testifying. Lightning flashed again, illuminating new vehicles arriving outside. Through her scope, Mags counted 4 black SUVs moving into position, but they weren't the only new arrivals. "Sarah," she whispered into her radio, "signal the FBI teams, it's time." Because what Reed hadn't realized, what even Torres hadn't figured out yet, was that every vehicle approaching the farm had been carefully tracked. Every transmission from Reed's satellite phone had been monitored, and Chamberlain's desperate attempt to contain the situation was about to lead him right into a trap 4 decades in the making. "One last lesson, Reed," Mags announced. "One. I tried to teach you 40 years ago. A sniper's greatest weapon isn't the rifle, it's patience, and I've been very, very patient." Through the barn's windows, headlights appeared on the approach road. In the bunker's green glow, more files appeared. Active operations, current contracts, living proof of Chamberlain's ongoing crimes. "You know what else today is?" Mags asked, watching through her scope as a familiar figure emerged from the lead vehicle. "It's the day Shadow Scout completes her final mission, the one that started the night you tried to bury the truth and created a legend instead." Because approaching the barn, walking directly into her carefully laid trap, was Colonel James Chamberlain himself, and he had no idea he was about to face a reckoning 40 years in the making. Colonel James Chamberlain's appearance had barely changed in 40 years, still ramrod straight, still radiating authority. But as he approached the barn through the rain, Mags noted the subtle signs of desperation in his movements, the slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted to the shadows. "Quite a reunion you've arranged, Margaret." His voice carried clearly through her directional microphone, "though I'm surprised you settled for such a small audience." "Oh, the audience is bigger than you think, James," Mags replied through the speakers. "Much bigger." Through her scope, she watched him process this, watched him note the bunker's active systems, the streaming data, Reed's pale face. The moment he realized what was really happening. "You're broadcasting this," he said flatly. "All of it. Have been for the past hour," Mags confirmed. "Every file, every operation, every crime. Live to every intelligence agency that's been hunting your shadow army. But you already know that, don't you? That's why you had to come personally. Only your command codes can stop the broadcast." Chamberlain's security team spread out, taking positions, professional, but Mags could see the uncertainty in their movements. They knew something was wrong, but couldn't identify the threat. "Sarah," Mags whispered into her radio, "status of FBI teams." "In position." the deputy replied softly, "waiting for your signal." Inside the barn, Torres and his men had backed further into the shadows, weapons ready but not raised. They'd become witnesses to history, and they knew it. Reed's team looked increasingly uncertain, caught between loyalty and survival. "You've gotten slow, Margaret," Chamberlain called out. "Sloppy. Broadcasting your position like this? The shadow. Scout I knew would never be so obvious." "Unless that was exactly the point," Mags responded. "You taught me something important, James, back when you betrayed us. You taught me that sometimes the most obvious trap is the one people walk into anyway, because they think they're too smart to fall for it." Lightning flashed again, and in that instant of illumination, Mags saw Chamberlain's expression change, saw him finally understand the full scope of what she'd done. The farm, the bunker, the escaped convicts, he pieced it together. "You orchestrated all of it, even Torres's escape. You arranged that somehow. Just like you arranged for my team to be in the wrong place 40 years ago, Mags confirmed. "The difference is, my setup ends with justice, not murder." Through her scope, she watched as more vehicles approached, unmarked, but clearly government issue. Chamberlain's empire was about to collapse, and he knew it, but cornered predators are the most dangerous. "Reed," Chamberlain barked, "clear the barn, no witnesses." But Reed hesitated, looking at the streaming data on the bunker's screens, at the evidence of decades of crimes, at the young operators under his command who were starting to back away. "Your choice, Reed," Mags announced. "Die for his lies or live for the truth. 40 years ago, you chose wrong. Here's your second chance." The storm reached its peak as everyone in and around the barn faced the same decision. Chamberlain's authority versus undeniable evidence, loyalty to corruption versus the chance for redemption. Through her scope, Mags watched them all. Reed wrestling with decades of choices, Torres and his men ready for whatever came next. Sarah's finger steady on, her trigger waiting for the signal. And in the center of it all, Chamberlain, still believing he could control the situation, still not understanding that every move he made had been anticipated decades ago by a sniper who'd learned that patience was the deadliest weapon of all. The next few minutes would determine everything: justice or corruption, truth or lies, redemption or damnation. And Shadow Scout was ready to ensure the right side won. The rain hammered against the barn's metal roof as Chamberlain took 3 measured steps forward. Through her scope, Mags watched his face, the micro-expressions she'd learned to read decades ago. He was calculating odds, looking for options, refusing to believe he'd lost control. "One last chance, James," Mags announced through the speakers. "Surrender now. End this properly." "Or what?" Chamberlain's voice carried authority earned through years of command. "You'll shoot me? Create a martyr for my organization to rally behind?" "No," Mags replied calmly. "I won't shoot anyone I don't need to. Check your phone again." She watched him pull out his satellite phone, saw his face change as new messages appeared. Through her directional microphone, she heard his sharp intake of breath. "Impossible," he whispered. "Those accounts were untraceable." "Nothing's untraceable, James. You taught me that. Every shell company, every hidden account, every secret operation, all being exposed right now. Your empire isn't just falling, it's being dismantled piece by piece." Sarah's voice whispered through the radio. FBI teams reporting simultaneous. Raids at 17 locations. They're hitting Chamberlain's entire network. Inside the barn, Reed's remaining loyal men watched the bunker's screens as more data streamed past. Their own operations, their own crimes, all being broadcast worldwide. The younger operators had already lowered their weapons, backing away from their commander. "Your choice is simple," Mags continued. "Surrender now, protect your people, maybe salvage some honor, or watch everything you built burn while you stand here in the rain, pretending you still have control." Torres and his men had positioned themselves strategically, understanding they were now part of something much bigger than their escape. Through her scope, Mag saw Torres studying Chamberlain with professional assessment, recognizing the dangerous moment when a commander realizes he's lost everything. "Sarah," Mags whispered, "signal the FBI teams to move closer, but hold position until my mark." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark relief. Chamberlain's security team looking increasingly uncertain. Reed's operators choosing sides. Torres and his men ready for whatever came next. "You think you've won?" Chamberlain's voice had turned cold. "Think you've accounted for everything? But you forgot something crucial, Margaret. Something about me you should have remembered from 40 years ago." "And what's that, James?" "I never leave witnesses." His hand moved toward his jacket, and in that instant Mag saw what no one else had noticed, the small device partially concealed by his sleeve. "A dead man's switch. If I press this button," Chamberlain announced, "every computer in that bunker overloads. The evidence, the witnesses, everything goes up in flames, just like 40 years ago." But Mags had been waiting for this moment. Planned for it decades ago, when she'd first bought this farm and discovered its hidden bunker. "One last lesson, James," she said quietly. "Something I learned in Vietnam, watching targets walk into kill zones they thought they controlled." Through her scope, she saw him hesitate. "Sometimes," she continued, "the most dangerous position isn't where the enemy can see you, it's where they think they're safe." The wind chimes she'd positioned years ago sang their warning pattern. Sarah's laser sight appeared on Chamberlain's chest, and in the distance, FBI teams moved into their final positions. The storm reached its peak as Shadow Scout prepared to spring the last part of a trap 40 years in the making. Because what Chamberlain still hadn't realized was that every move, every choice, every option he thought he had been orchestrated by a sniper who'd learned that true victory sometimes meant not taking the shot at all. The dead man's switch gleamed dully in Chamberlain's hand as rain poured down around him. Through her scope, Mags watched his security team process this new development, saw the moment they realized their commander was willing to sacrifice them all. "You know what your real weakness was, James?" Mags asked through the speakers. "You never understood loyalty, real loyalty, the kind that goes both ways." Reed stepped forward then, moving away from his increasingly uncertain team. "Sir," his voice carried clearly through Mag's directional mic, "maybe we should consider—" "Consider what?" Chamberlain cut him off. "Surrender. Let 40 years of work be destroyed by one stubborn old woman?" "By one stubborn old woman who was right," Torres called from inside the barn. "Who spent 40 years planning this moment while you spent 40 years hiding from it." The bunker's screens continued streaming data, each file another nail in Chamberlain's coffin. Through her scope, Mags watched his expression darken as he saw his life's work being systematically exposed. "Sarah," Mags whispered into her radio, "status of FBI teams." "Ready on your signal," the deputy replied. "But if he triggers that device—" "He won't," Mags assured her, "because he still hasn't figured out the most important piece." Inside the barn, Reed's younger operators had made their decision. One by one, they lowered their weapons, stepping away from their commander. Even Torres's men seemed to sense the gravity of the moment, maintaining their positions but holding their fire. "Last chance, everyone," Mags announced. "Choose carefully, because what happens next will define you forever." Reed looked between his former mentor and his current commander, decades of choices weighing on him. Through her scope, Mags saw the exact moment he made his decision. "Sir," Reed said quietly, "she's right. It's over." "Nothing's over." Chamberlain's finger tightened on the switch. "I built this organization from nothing, sacrificed everything for it. I won't let it end like this." "That's where you're wrong, James," Mags replied. "It ended 40 years ago, the night you ordered my team killed. Everything since then has just been preparation for this moment." Lightning flashed again, and in that instant of illumination, something changed in Chamberlain's eyes. Something final, dangerous. "If I'm going down," he snarled, "I'm taking you all with me." His finger moved toward the trigger, but before he could press it, Reed made his choice. Years of training under Shadow Scout finally overrode decades of corruption under Chamberlain. "Sir," Reed's voice carried command now, "don't." One by one, Chamberlain's security team turned, weapons lowering but not quite pointing at their former commander. Inside the barn, Torres and his men maintained their positions, understanding they were witnessing something historic. "You're all traitors," Chamberlain spat, but his hand trembled on the switch. "No," Mags corrected quietly. "They're soldiers remembering their real duty, the one you forgot 40 years ago." The storm's fury matched the moment as everyone faced their final choice: redemption or damnation, honor or corruption, truth or lies. Through her scope, Mags watched them all, Reed choosing right over easy, Torres choosing justice over escape, Sarah waiting patiently for her signal, and Chamberlain finally realizing that his greatest enemy hadn't been the sniper who survived his betrayal, but the corruption that had led him to betray her in the first place. Chamberlain's finger hovered over the dead man's switch as rain poured down around him. Through her scope, Mag saw what no one else could, the slight tremor in his hand, the micro-expressions crossing his face, the tells of a man about to make his final mistake. "Before you press that button," Mags announced through the speakers, "you might want to ask yourself something, James. Something important." "And what's that?" His voice carried forced confidence. "Why I let you bring that device here at all." The implications hit him just as Sarah's voice came through Mags's radio. "Signal jammers in position, just like you planned. All frequencies blocked except the ones you designated." Through her scope, Mags watched Chamberlain's expression change as he finally understood. The dead man's switch was useless, had been from the moment he arrived, just another part of her trap. "Impossible," he breathed. "The frequencies were encrypted, hardened by systems I helped design." Mags finished for him. "Remember who wrote your original security protocols, James? Who trained your first operators? Who knew exactly how you'd react tonight?" Inside the barn, the bunker's screens continued streaming data worldwide. Reed's remaining men had fully turned now, weapons trained on their former commander. Torres and his team maintained their positions, understanding they were witnessing the end of something historic. "It's over, sir," Reed said quietly. "She beat us 40 years ago. We just didn't know it until now." Chamberlain's security team began backing away, following Reed's lead. The colonel stood alone in the rain, still clutching his useless switch, decades of power slipping away. "You think this ends with me?" he snarled. "The organization is bigger than one person. Others will take control." "Check your phone again," Mags interrupted. "See what's happening right now at every location in your network." She watched through her scope as he read the incoming messages, saw the moment he realized the full scope of her operation. "Simultaneous raids," she explained. "Every safe house, every training facility, every hidden account. All your lieutenants being arrested at exactly this moment, because timing, as I always taught, is everything." Lightning flashed again, illuminating the scene in stark clarity. FBI teams had moved closer, maintaining their perimeter. Sarah's laser sight remained steady on Chamberlain's chest. And in the darkness, Shadow Scout prepared to demonstrate her final lesson. "You want to know the real difference between us, James?" Mags asked quietly. "Why I won and you lost." "Enlighten me," he spat, but his voice had lost its authority. "You thought power came from fear, from control, from being willing to sacrifice others for your goals." She paused, letting the truth sink in. "But real power comes from being willing to sacrifice yourself for something bigger, from choosing right over easy, from understanding that some victories don't require a single shot." The storm's Fury seemed to pause as her words hung in the air. Through her scope, Mags watched decades of certainty crumble in Chamberlain's eyes. The dead man's switch, he realized. You knew I'd bring it, knew I'd try to take everyone with me. You counted on it. Because some targets, Mags confirmed, defeat themselves. All you have to do is give them the right opportunity. Reed stepped forward then, years of training under Shadow Scout finally overcoming decades of corruption under Chamberlain. "Sir," he said firmly, "put down the switch." One by one, every weapon in the area turned toward Chamberlain. Not just Reed's men and Torres's team, but his own security detail. All making the same choice Shadow Scout had made 40 years ago, choosing honor over corruption, truth over power. And in that moment, as Chamberlain faced the full weight of his choices, Mags demonstrated why some legends never die. Because true victory doesn't always come from pulling the trigger. Sometimes it comes from knowing exactly when not to. The morning sun broke through dissipating storm clouds as FBI teams led Chamberlain away in handcuffs. Mags watched from her porch, coffee cup steady in her weathered hands, while Sarah Chen supervised the collection of evidence from the bunker. "You knew," Reed said quietly, approaching under escort. "Knew exactly how it would end." "Had 40 years to plan it," Mags replied, taking another sip. "Learned something important in Vietnam. Sometimes the best shot is the one you don't take." Through the morning mist, she could see Torres and his men being processed by federal agents. They'd chosen to surrender, understanding their testimony about tonight would mean more than any escape could offer. "What happens now?" Reed asked, genuine uncertainty in his voice for the first time in decades. "Now?" Mags set down her coffee cup. "Now you do what I've been waiting 40 years for you to do. Make things right. Tell the truth, all of it." Sarah approached, holstering her weapon. "Federal prosecutors are already talking deals," she reported. "Everyone's racing to testify first. Chamberlain's whole network is unraveling." "And the evidence?" Mags asked, though she already knew the answer. "Transmitted successfully to every major intelligence agency worldwide. No putting that genie back in the bottle." Mags nodded, satisfaction in her eyes. 40 years of patience, of maintaining her cover as just another retired farmer, had paid off more completely than anyone but she had imagined. "You taught us to think 3 moves ahead," Reed said, understanding finally dawning. "But you were thinking 40 years ahead." "Had to," Mags replied simply. "Some victories take time. Some wounds need more than vengeance to heal." As federal agents continued their work, Tom Cooper's patrol car pulled up. The sheriff stepped out, surveying the scene with professional pride. "Told you I could handle unwanted visitors," Mags called to him, allowing herself a small smile. "Never doubted it, Shadow Scout," he replied, "though next time, maybe warn me when you're planning to take down an entire criminal empire." "Where's the fun in that?" The morning light strengthened, revealing the full scope of last night's operation. FBI evidence teams cataloging decades of secrets, federal marshals processing former members of Chamberlain's organization, and in the center of it all, one elderly farmer whose patience had finally paid off. "You'll be in the history books now," Sarah said, rejoining them on the porch. "The sniper who took down an empire without firing a shot." "No," Mags corrected gently. "Just someone who remembered what too many forget. That real strength isn't about who has the most power. It's about how you choose to use the power you have." As the sun rose fully over her farm, Margaret Shadow Scout Sullivan watched the last pieces of a 40-year operation fall into place. Justice had finally been served, not through violence but through patience, wisdom, and the steady aim of a legendary sniper who'd never forgotten her true mission: to protect, to serve, and to prove that some battles are won, not with bullets, but with honor. And somewhere in the morning light, the legend of Shadow Scout grew just a little larger, reminding everyone that true heroes don't always need weapons to change the world. Sometimes they just need coffee, patience, and the wisdom to know when not to pull the trigger.